This episode is sponsored by Endel, an app that creates personalized soundscapes to help you focus, relax, and sleep. The first 100 people to click our link in the description will get a 1-week free trial. It's probably hard to ignore the very obvious green algae taking up most of your screen, but for the moment, I want you to try. Look away from the Closterium and instead shift your focus to the area that surrounds it. At first, it may not seem that interesting, just a sea of dark blue interrupted only by tiny little dots. But unlike the completely static Closterium, those tiny dots are wiggling around in frantic, uncoordinated directions like they're all dancing to a million different soundtracks played at once. There are organisms in the world of the microcosmos that move in concerted, directed ways, but this is definitely not that. Now let's focus on the Closterium. Look towards the tip of the algae, where there are round barium crystals wiggling around in the same random way that those particles we saw before were. We're going to see that type of motion over and over again today, because it's all over the microcosmos, found in and around many different types of organisms. And this kind of random motion may seem almost too trivial to discuss, leading at best to an end where I mull over the way that randomness seems to pop up everywhere, like some kind of unifying force that shapes our lives through millions of tiny coincidences, except, well, there's no point waiting until the end to say all that, because the reason we want to talk about this weird wiggling motion is that this randomness really does tie us together, not metaphorically, but very, very literally and physically. This motion that you see is proof of something fundamental, not just to life, but to existence itself. This movement is proof of atoms. It's easy to take the existence of atoms for granted now, in the same way that it's easy to take the existence of microbes for granted. Once you know about them and how they shape the world, and you've been told about them since you were a child, it's impossible to see the world as existing without them. But our knowledge of both is relatively recent, even if it's built on work that spans millennia. And just as the microscope has been essential to our understanding of microbes, it has played an important role in understanding atoms. Long before the existence of the microscope, though, there was an idea. In the 5th century BCE, a Greek philosopher named Democritus proposed that if you kept breaking matter down further and further, you would eventually reach something that could no longer be broken down. That invisible thing was what he called atomos, which meant uncuttable. Democritus's theory was in opposition to the ideas of Aristotle and Plato, who believed that the world was composed of 4 basic elements: earth, wind, air, and fire. So what does Democritus have to do with the tiny little wobbles in the pigments inside of the stentor? For that, we have to flash forward to 1827. This was an exciting time for anyone interested in diving deep into what matter was made of. The end of the 18th century had seen important advances in our understanding of matter, and in 1803, the scientist John Dalton drew upon these ideas to propose that each chemical element could be described by a particular atom. The atom became a useful tool in developing new theories about how our world is built, and 19th century physicists used it to describe a theory of gases that assumed they were composed of many, many tiny particles constantly moving around. But these theories were not proof. If anything, they raised more questions about how to think about atoms. Should we think about atoms as some kind of mathematical metaphor, or were they something real? And how could we find proof of something as unseeable as an atom? The answer, it would turn out, would come thanks to a botanist named Robert Brown. Brown was not setting out to solve the problem of atoms. It was the summer of 1827, and he was trying to clear up some questions he had about the tiny particles that burst out of pollen grains like this one. So he did what we are doing right now. he brought out his microscope and he looked at some tiny things under it. While we didn't have these pollen particles on hand, we imagined that what he saw was similar to these oil droplets, which came from the body of a dying copepod. He said simply, "While examining the form of these particles immersed in water, I observed many of them very evidently in motion." Curious about this motion, Brown proceeded to do a number of different experiments. He looked at pollen from other plants and saw the same motion. He looked at pollen from dead plants and saw the same motion. He even moved on to inorganic materials like rocks and saw the same motion. In water, everything wiggled, even if it wasn't living. And that meant the motion wasn't something biological. It was rooted in something else. These random movements are what we now call Brownian motion. And in the decades that followed his observation, physicists began to study it in earnest so they could understand the forces that shaped the movement. For example, one scientist noted that smaller particles exhibited faster motion compared to larger ones, which you can see at play here in the crystals lying within this amoeba, with the larger crystals moving more slowly compared to the smaller ones. But Brownian motion's biggest impact would come in 1905, when a scientist theorized that the movement of the particles Brown had watched was the result of other, smaller particles colliding with them. That scientist, you probably know the name of, it was Albert Einstein. And those smaller particles were water molecules composed of atoms that are packed with energy. And because of that energy, water molecules are constantly moving and colliding. Sometimes they collide with each other, and sometimes they collide into other larger particles, which move erratically in response. That is Brownian motion, a movement shaped by atoms and their kinetic energy. Einstein's theories were built on equations, but they provided a framework that would allow experimentalists to use Brownian motion as a way to see atoms and their energy at work. And ultimately, it was the French scientist Jean Perrin who put these theories to the test, using a new microscope called the ultramicroscope to not only study Brownian motion and confirm the equations that drove Einstein's theory, but also to estimate the size of water molecules. All of that discovery was made possible because a botanist wanted to study some pollen. Robert Brown was operating in a realm that is familiar to us here on Journey to the Microcosmos. He was exploring an invisible world. But what he studied and what he described helped us find an even more invisible world, one that was still invisible under his microscope and yet responsible for everything he was seeing, not just the motions of pollen grains, but the pollen grains themselves and everything else that was under his microscope, outside of his microscope, and even the microscope itself. What he found in those wiggles, and what you are seeing now in the same motion more than a century later, is an invisible world that built an entire universe. Thank you for coming on this journey with us as we explore the unseen world that surrounds us. And thank you to Endel for sponsoring this episode. Endel is an app that takes everything we know about sound, combines it with technology, and creates personalized soundscapes to help you focus, relax, and sleep. Their app was named the Apple Watch App of the Year in 2020, and they have a brand new soundscape called Wind Down that was made in collaboration with James Blake. The goal of Wind Down is to help you transition from an active day, which we all have, to a calmer state. So it's also great just before bed. Sound has a direct impact on your physical and mental well-being, and by adapting in real time to things like your location, the weather, and your heart rate, Endel creates simple, pleasant sounds that can help to calm your mind. If you're interested in trying out Endel, just be one of the first 100 people to download it using the link in the description, and you will get a free week of audio experiences. Thank you to all the people whose names are on the screen right now. They are our Patreon patrons. We love what we do at Journey to the Microcosmos. This team is just delighted to be able to do it, and I am so glad that other people love it too, because without them, we would definitely not be able to do it. So thank you so much to all of our patrons, and if you are interested in becoming one, you can check it out at patreon.com/journeytomicro. If you want to see more from our master of microscopes, James Weiss, you can check out Jam and Germs on Instagram. And if you want to see more from us, there's always a subscribe button somewhere nearby.